Rain fell over Ashmere the night the Alpha King was carried through its gates bleeding. A silver blade had opened his ribs, and something darker than silver was already moving beneath his skin. Captain Hale did not have time to reach the royal healers, so he brought King Dorian to the one healer who was still awake in the storm, Lyra Ashen, the woman whose village his own seal had chained. When they laid him on her table, Lyra felt her whole body go cold. This was the man who had signed the order to occupy Ashmere, the man whose soldiers had broken Callan's hand and called it discipline, the man whose name alone had opened every locked door in her village. Hale's voice cracked through the room. If he dies here, they will burn Ashmere to the ground and call it justice. Lyra looked down at the wound. Her fingers hovered above the blood. Every wound she heals, without recording its truth, leaves an echo in her own body. That was her curse, the one no healer chose and no healer could refuse. A wound healed without witness becomes a pain the healer must carry. She did not know yet what kind of wound this was. She only knew it had arrived with no truth attached to it. The moment Lyra touched the wound, the pain answered inside her own ribs. Not because she loved him, because the wound had no truth attached to it yet. And beneath that pain, something else stirred, something older than the curse, a pull deep and undeniable, rising through her blood toward the man on her table. Fate had tied her to the man whose seal had opened every door in Ashmere. She hated it instantly. Dorian's eyes opened, glassy with fever, and his wolf recognized her before his mind could stop it. His wolf reached for the healer his crown had taught him to hate. He did not know her name yet. But something in his chest had already decided she mattered. "I have saved worse men," Lyra said, reaching for her needle. "And I have spared worse villages," Dorian answered, his voice rough with pain. She did not answer him. She threaded the needle instead, not because she forgave him, because Ashmere could not survive the army's grief if their king died on her floor. Lyra sat beside him through what remained of the night, watching the fever rise and fall across his face like weather she could not control. She told herself she was only doing what any healer would do. But some quiet part of her kept listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the way a person listens for a storm to break. By the time the first gray light touched the window, she had convinced herself the danger had passed. She was wrong, though she would not understand how wrong for many days yet. Ashmere had once been known across the kingdom as a neutral healing village. No soldier, no rebel, no stranger was turned away from its doors. That neutrality ended the night royal supply wagons were ambushed on the northern road. General Varric told the crown that Ashmere was hiding the rebels responsible. Dorian signed the occupation order without visiting the village himself. Since then, soldiers had searched homes at will. Medicine stores were counted and rationed by strangers with swords. Men were pulled from their beds for questioning. Children were forbidden from gathering herbs in the forest beyond the fence. Healers needed written permission before treating anyone they did not already know. Guards stood at the gate day and night, watching everyone who came and went. A mother might be questioned twice for the same loaf of bread. Once by the soldier who searched her kitchen, and once again by the officer who reviewed his report. An old man might be held at the gate for an hour simply because his hands shook when a guard asked his name. None of it was called cruelty in the official records. It was called vigilance. And vigilance, the villagers learned quickly, could not be argued with. In that village, silence itself had become evidence of guilt. Lyra carried more wounds than her own. Her back ached whenever she heard the clatter of armor near her door. Her hands trembled around fever root, though her fingers had never once been cut by it. Her throat closed whenever a child cried after a search. None of those wounds belonged to her body, but because no one had written down the truth behind them, they had settled into her anyway. Dorian carried a wound of his own, one that had shaped him long before he wore a crown. His mother had died in an ambush, the crown blamed on rebels the village refused to name. General Varric had used that grief like a blade, telling him again and again that a hesitant king buries his mother twice. Both of them carried real pain, but both of them were looking at each other through wounds that other men had learned to use. Lyra treated him in a room crowded with soldiers who did not trust her hands. She ordered Hale to keep them silent if he wanted his king to live. Dorian drifted between fever and command, but even half-conscious, he still tried to give orders. Lyra told him he had commanded plenty without ever once walking through this village, as a healer would. Dorian said an innocent village had no reason to hide knives beneath its floorboards. Lyra said a searched village would hide bread itself if soldiers called bread a weapon. Between them, the bond pulsed, hot and unwelcome. Dorian hated it. His wolf reached for the healer his crown had taught him to hate. Lyra hated it too, because it meant she could feel his pain even when she wanted nothing but distance from him. As she worked, she noticed things that unsettled her. The wound was cold instead of swollen. The blood at the edges refused to clot. A thin, silvery black line moved beneath his skin like a vein of frost. The pulse at his throat, the mark of his alpha command, beat unevenly, out of rhythm with the rest of him. And the mate bond itself burned instead of warming, sharp where it should have been gentle. Old healer Mavna, watching from the doorway, told her to look again. Lyra hesitated. Part of her told herself it was ordinary silver poisoning, nothing more. But a deeper part of her did not want to give this man the full attention a healer owed every patient. She closed the wound and moved on. He lived through the night, but what she had refused to name did not disappear. The wound she refused to name did not vanish. It moved into her. A cold ache settled beneath her own ribs, quiet and patient, waiting. Dorian was forced to remain in Ashmere while his body slowly recovered enough to travel. For the first time, he saw the village with his own eyes instead of through Varric's reports. Children fell silent whenever soldiers walked past. Women hid medicine beneath loose floorboards before a search could find it. Old men bore faint bruises around their wrists where restraints had been tightened too hard. The healing house itself was short on fever root because the army had confiscated most of it as contraband. Widow Saris would not look at the royal banner hanging above the gate. Young Callan flinched at the sound of armor, his damaged hand curling instinctively against his chest. Dorian asked why people who had done nothing wrong looked so afraid. Lyra handed him her healing ledger without a word. Page after page recorded wounds that had come from what the army called lawful searches. Broken fingers, torn shoulders, a child's burned arm from a knocked-over lamp during a night raid. Dorian read in silence, and doubt crept in where certainty had always lived before. He did not want to believe he had been wrong, because if Ashmere was not a nest of rebels, then he had not protected his kingdom. He had let his kingdom hurt a village that had done nothing but stay quiet out of fear. Lyra watched him go still over her ledger. Why do they flinch at a knock and not at a knife? Dorian asked her one evening, watching Tessa freeze at the sound of boots outside. Lyra did not answer right away. She let the silence sit between them, the way she let a wound breathe before she judged how deep it ran. Because the knife only threatens once, she finally said. The knock threatens every single day, and none of you ever tell them why. Dorian had no answer for that. He had spent his whole reign believing that fear and guilt looked the same from a throne. Standing in Ashmere, close enough to see the fear up close, he could no longer pretend the two were one thing. She had not forgiven him. But for the first time, she saw him actually looking instead of simply commanding. Varric moved quickly once he learned the king still lived. He staged a fabricated attack near the village, drawing both soldiers and villagers into chaos at the tree line. Dorian tried to use his Alpha command to protect the people caught in the crossfire. He meant to say the words that would end the danger cleanly. Protect the villagers, but the venom still coiled in his blood twisted the command as it left him. Hold the villagers. Half his soldiers heard protection, half heard capture. The pack bond fractured into contradictory signals, men turning on each other's intentions in the space of a heartbeat. The mate bond twisted with it. Lyra felt his intention arrive inside her chest, warped beyond recognition. The bond did not feel warm. It felt like a hand closing around her village. She staggered back, certain in that instant that he was trying to use the bond to control her. Dorian felt her fear through the same bond and did not understand why, because he had wanted nothing but her safety. The formation broke apart. Villagers scattered in every direction. Soldiers shouted orders that contradicted the orders shouted beside them. Sergeant Oren saw little Tessa trapped between two lines of soldiers who no longer agreed on what they were supposed to do. He threw himself toward her without hesitation. A blade meant for someone else opened his side instead. Lyra ran to him through the smoke and confusion, dropping to her knees in the mud. The moment her hands found his wound, the pain settled into her own palm, sharp and immediate. His wound settled in her palm, right where she had chosen not to look closely enough. She looked past Oren's blood toward Dorian and saw the same silvery black thread crawling up the side of his throat. She recognized it now. It was the same mark she had seen, the night she stitched his ribs and told herself it was nothing. Old healer Mavna did not need to say a word. Lyra already understood. She had not created the ambush, but her hatred had made her look away from a wound that deserved better care. Rain still fell around them, mixing with the blood on her hands until she could no longer tell where the water ended and the wound began. Oren's breathing was shallow and fast, and for a moment Lyra was certain she had lost him. She pressed both hands against the wound and forced herself to stop shaking, forced her focus back into the only place it had ever truly belonged, the body in front of her. Slowly his breathing steadied. Slowly the bleeding slowed beneath her palms. Only when she was certain he would live did she allow herself to look up at what her carelessness had cost. In front of Dorian, in front of Oren, in front of everyone bleeding around her, she spoke the truth plainly. Hatred made me careless. In the days after the chaos, Lyra found herself trusted by no one completely. The villagers were angry that she had spent her skill saving the king who had ordered their homes searched. The soldiers blamed her for missing the venom that had turned their king's own command against his men. Dorian did not offer easy forgiveness, but he also did not hide from what he had done. Old healer Mavna led Lyra into the recovery room, where villagers and royal soldiers now lay side by side on the same worn mats. She spoke quietly, the way she always did when a lesson mattered more than comfort. A healer does not choose who deserves pain, she said. Only how much pain must be stopped before it spreads. Lyra had to treat Oren, a soldier of the crown who had nearly died pulling a village child out of danger. She had to treat one of the men who had once torn Widow Ceres's home apart searching for hidden rebels. She had to calm Callan, whose whole body locked with fear at the sound of armor clinking near his cot. War, she realized, did not divide its wounds as cleanly as anger wanted it to. From that understanding, she built something new. She called it the Neutral Wound Ledger. In it, she recorded who was wounded, what weapon had caused it, where the wound occurred, who had given the order, who had witnessed it, what medicine had been taken, and by whom, what poison had been used if any, whether a command had been twisted, who had been refused treatment, and whether any official report had lied about the cause. When she wrote down the true origin of Oren's wound, the ache in her palm finally eased. It did not vanish. She began keeping the ledger every evening, by candlelight, long after the healing house had gone quiet. Each entry felt like setting down something she had been carrying without realizing its weight. Saris often sat with her during those hours, saying little, simply keeping her company the way, old friends do when words are not required. Slowly, the villagers who had once refused to speak to Lyra began arriving at her door on their own, offering their accounts before she even had to ask. They wanted to be written down. They wanted, more than anything, to stop being nameless. But for the first time, it stopped pretending the pain belonged to her alone. Dorian asked to see the original reports that had condemned Ashmere in the first place. Lyra showed him her healing ledger, page by page. Widow Saris gave her account of the night her husband was taken for questioning and never properly returned. Callan said little, but he placed his damaged hand on the table and let it speak for him. Captain Hale brought the search orders and found that many had been signed under Varric's authority, using the broad powers Dorian himself had granted without limit. Dorian tried to say he had not known what was happening on the ground. Lyra cut him off before the sentence could finish. Not knowing is not innocence when your seal opened every door. The words struck harder than any accusation Varric had ever made. Dorian understood, finally, that his failure had never been striking a village with his own hands. His failure was signing away unchecked power and calling the aftermath order. Power made me certain before truth had spoken, he admitted. Lyra felt the bond between them soften, just slightly, not because she forgave him, but because, for the first time, he was not hiding behind the crown to escape his own signature. Together with Hale, Mavna, and Saris, Lyra began piecing the neutral wound ledger into a single pattern. What emerged was damning. Soldiers and villagers had been wounded by the same distinctive blade. Weapons blamed on rebels carried hidden markings from royal armories. Every staged ambush had occurred exactly when Varric needed more authority granted to him. Medicine confiscated from Ashmere had turned up inside Varric's private barracks. Letters supposedly written by rebels used the same ink kept only in military stores. Bodies at the ambush site had been arranged to suggest a battle that never truly happened that way, and the venom itself required ingredients found only inside the royal military's own medical stores. Varric was not fighting a rebellion. He was manufacturing one. He belonged to a faction called the Red Barrack Circle, men who believed that peace made kings weak, because peace forced a king to listen to healers, villagers, and witnesses instead of generals. Peace makes kings listen to healers, Varric said when they finally confronted him. War makes them listen to generals, he added, as if that alone justified everything. He turned on Dorian first. Your mother died because a king hesitated. Ashmere is what hesitation looks like before it grows teeth. Then he turned his cruelty toward Lyra. Your healer hands shook because you wanted him to hurt. I only gave your hatred a sharper instrument. Lyra could not fully deny it. Varric had not created her hatred. He had simply found it and sharpened it into a weapon she had not realized she was holding. It was in that moment she understood something clearly. If she did not record her own wounds honestly, someone else would use them against her. Varric watched the realization cross her face and smiled, certain he had already won something. "You see it now," he said. "A kingdom built on healers and confessions will collapse the first time it needs a sword." Dorian stepped between them, his voice low and steady despite the poison still moving through his blood. "A kingdom built on lies collapses too," he said. "It just takes longer, and it buries more people on the way down." Varric's smile did not fade, but something behind his eyes did, as though he had expected agreement instead of resistance. On the final night, Varric's soldiers surrounded Ashmere, claiming the village was holding their king hostage. The healing house filled quickly with the wounded, villagers and royal soldiers together, children and elders, people who had hated one another only days before. Lyra refused to let her healing house become a place of revenge. She organized the room like a battlefield of mercy instead. Mavna worked to slow the spreading poison in the worst cases. Hale guarded the door with what strength he had left. Orin, still weak from his own wound, carried children down to the medicine cellar for safety. Little Tessa moved between cots, bringing water to soldier and villager alike, without asking which side they belonged to. Saris sat with the ledger, writing down every name, every wound, every cause as it arrived. Dorian wanted to walk outside and face Varric directly, to end it with the weight of his crown. Lyra stopped him. His command was still unstable, the venom not yet fully cleared, the bond between them still bent by its poison. "Do not turn my patience into proof that you are still king," she told him. He listened. It was the first time he had truly let someone else lead instead of proving his authority through force. When Varric finally forced his way inside, he declared that the village was sheltering rebels under the king's own nose. Lyra threw open the door to the recovery room. Royal soldiers lay beside Ashmere's own wounded, breathing the same air, marked by the same silver blades, poisoned by the same venom. A soldier who had once broken down Saris's door now lay 2 cots away from the son whose home it had been, both of them fighting the same fever, both of them poisoned by the same silver. Varric's own men went quiet at the sight, some of them lowering their weapons without being ordered to. Whatever story they had been told about this village, it had not included this. Different uniforms, the same enemy. In the middle of the chaos, 3 people needed Lyra at once. Dorian's wound had reopened, the venom surging back through his blood, threatening to steal his command entirely if left untreated. Orin's old injury had torn again in the fighting, blood soaking fast through the bandages Lyra had wrapped only days before, and Callan, her own younger brother, had been struck while pulling children away from a broken doorway. Villagers shouted for her to save Callan first. Hale shouted that the kingdom needed Dorian alive to call off his soldiers. Orin said nothing at all, fighting simply to stay conscious. Lyra stood between 3 people she loved, feared, and could not fully separate from her own heart, and for a moment she nearly broke apart where she stood. Mavna's hand closed firmly over hers. "Not who you love, not who you hate. Who can still be saved if your hands move now?" Lyra chose Orin first. Not because she loved him more than the others, not because he wore a crown or shared her blood, but because his wound would kill him within minutes, while Mavna could hold back Dorian's poison a little longer, and Saris could slow Callan's bleeding until Lyra's hands were free. It was the truest moment of her calling as a healer. She chose according to what could still be saved, not according to love or hatred. When Varric mocked her, sneering that healers always sided with the weak, Lyra answered without hesitation. "No, I chose the wounded. Varric turned his fury on Dorian, demanding he use his Alpha command to crush the village once and for all. He claimed the villagers had taken their own king hostage. He claimed the healing house itself was nothing but a rebel stronghold in disguise. He claimed that a true Alpha King would never let a healer decide what justice looked like. Dorian felt the old instinct rise in his throat, the roar that could silence an entire room, force soldiers to their knees, end the chaos in a single terrible breath. A command could make the room obey. It could not make the wound true. He remembered what unchecked commands had already cost this village. He remembered mistaking silence for guilt, order for peace, obedience for proof of loyalty. He had mistaken silence for order once. He would not mistake obedience for justice again. He lowered his voice instead of raising it. Lyra stepped forward with the neutral wound ledger open in her hands. She did not accuse Varric with rage. The ledger did not accuse Varric with anger. It accused him with wounds that matched. Blade wounds on soldiers and villagers curved identically. Weapons blamed on rebels bore the unmistakable stamp of royal armories. The poison in Dorian's blood required components found only in the Red Barracks stores. Medicines stolen from Ashmere sat inside Varric's own private tents. Search orders showed times quietly altered after the fact. Patrol routes had been changed under Varric's personal signature just before each staged attack. Oren's wound matched exactly the moment Dorian's command had twisted from protection into capture. Saris stood as a living witness to what had truly happened to her husband. Hale confirmed that patrol routes had shifted strangely before every single ambush. Varric tried to dismiss it all as the bitter tales of frightened villagers. But this time, royal soldiers stood beside them as witnesses too. Oren, pale and barely upright, said plainly that Ashmere had pulled wounded soldiers into its healing house rather than letting them die outside its walls. Hale laid his sword at Dorian's feet and admitted that military reports had been twisted into a weapon aimed at innocent people. Varric's own men began turning away from him. Dorian gave the order to arrest him. Not with fury, not with the crushing weight of Alpha Command, but with evidence, testimony, and wounds that could no longer be denied. After the battle for Ashmere ended, Dorian stood before the village without a raised platform beneath his feet. He did not stand behind a victory banner. He stood level with the villagers, in the very square where soldiers had once torn through their homes. He spoke plainly, without the shield of his crown. I called your silence guilt because it was easier than asking what my soldiers had taught you to fear. He looked toward Callan, whose injured hand was still carefully bandaged. My seal did not strike Callan, but it opened the door for the men who did. He admitted everything, without excuse. He had signed the occupation order based on a report from a single biased source. He had allowed Varric's authority to stretch far beyond any reasonable limit. He had treated a frightened village's silence as though it were confession. He had ignored a neutral healer's warnings in favor of a general's certainty. He had called a wounded village a nest of rebellion. He had resented the very bond that had tied him to a woman his own crown had taught him to despise. Lyra spoke next, not to destroy herself with guilt, but to refuse the comfort of pretending she bore no fault at all. She stood before Oren and said what needed to be said. I did not choose to harm him, but I chose not to look as closely as a healer must. That was enough to make my hands part of the war. She admitted her failures plainly. She had let her hatred for Dorian dull the sharpness a healer owes every patient. She had ignored the early signs of the venom because the man on her table was someone she wanted to resent. That single choice had rippled outward, hurting Orin and others who never should have paid for her anger. She had let Ashmere's pain decide how carefully she was willing to look at another person's wound. Orin listened to every word without interrupting, and when she finished, he did not offer easy forgiveness. "I don't forgive you because you said the right words," he told her quietly. "I forgive you because you changed what you do with your hands after you said them." It was not comfort exactly, but it was honest, and Lyra had learned by then that honesty mattered more than comfort ever could. Dorian signed the Ashmere Healing Accord before the entire village. The accord forbade the army from occupying any village without an independent investigation first. It guaranteed healers the right to treat every side of a conflict without being branded traitors. It forbade the confiscation of medicine unless a healer witnessed and approved it. It required every wound of war to be formally documented. It required every wound caused by soldiers to record who had given the order, not simply labeled as an ordinary combat injury. It required military reports to be checked against the neutral wound ledger before any action was taken. It required search orders to carry real evidence and strict time limits. It gave accused villages the right to bring forward their own witnesses. It gave healers the right to demand a witness before treating any wound caused by war. It protected cursed healers from being forced to silently carry pain that belonged to hidden truths. It created the role of war healer advocate with the authority to halt any campaign if the ledger revealed the same weapon wounding both sides of a conflict. It gave that same advocate the right to open the neutral wound ledger before any village could be declared an enemy of the crown. The final clause Lyra wrote herself in her own steady hand. No wound of war may be treated as nameless when a crown has the power to name its enemy. Lyra became the kingdom's first war healer advocate, not because Dorian loved her, but because she had turned every wound into proof that could not be hidden beneath armor or authority. Weeks passed before Dorian returned to Ashmere. He came without an army at his back. He came without banners announcing a victory. He did not come asking to be forgiven. He carried fever root with him, the very medicine his soldiers had once confiscated from this village. Lyra did not smile when she saw him. She asked plainly if he had come expecting the bond to grant him forgiveness. He told her no. He did not ask if the bond could forgive him. He asked what the wounded still needed before forgiveness could have a language. What do the wounded still need before forgiveness has a language? He asked her directly. Lyra considered the question before answering. Records, witnesses, and kings who do not mistake silence for guilt. She placed a list in front of him. Names of other villages Varric had once condemned before anyone had bothered to count their injured. Then start with the villages your general called guilty before anyone counted the injured. Dorian took the list without argument. He said quietly, "I hated you before I knew what grief had made of you." Lyra answered just as quietly, "And I hated you before I knew what fear had made you sign." There was no mate claim between them that day. No wedding was announced, no coronation followed. Only an Alpha King learning to ask the wounded what they needed before he ever asked his generals what they wanted. He visited often after that, never announced, never escorted by more than a single guard. Sometimes he simply carried supplies. Sometimes he sat and listened while healers from other villages described what their own occupations had cost them. He did not speak much during those visits. He had learned, finally, that a crown listens better when it stops trying to answer everything at once. A year passed. Ashmere was no longer watched like a village suspected of hiding rebels. The healing house had grown into something larger, a center now known simply as the War Healer Ledger, where healers from distant villages came to learn Lyra's methods. They learned to record the wound, the weapon that caused it, the order that led to it, the medicine that had been taken and by whom, the testimony of survivors, the name of the one who gave the command, the name of the healer who treated it, the name of whoever had stood as witness. One evening, a young soldier from a border village was carried into the healing house, his wound still fresh. Lyra felt the familiar ache begin to form inside her palm as she reached for him. The curse had not left her. The pain still searched for a place to settle whenever a truth remained unspoken. But this time, it did not arrive alone. Orin opened the ledger without being asked. Saris stood ready to serve as witness. Hale read aloud the order that had led to the wound. Another healer beside Lyra noted the weapon that had caused it. Dorian entered quietly, and for once he did not ask who among them was guilty of rebellion. He asked only, who treated the wounded? Lyra set the neutral wound ledger on the table between them. Start with the bodies that survived, she said. As the wound was finally recorded in full, the ache in her hand began to ease. The pain did not leave her completely, but it no longer had to live unrecorded beneath her skin. Dorian had once believed rebellion could be measured by silence, fear, and locked doors. But Lyra taught him that war leaves its truth in wounds before it ever reaches a throne. She did not heal the kingdom by forgiving its king. The curse that had once felt like a punishment had become something closer to a purpose. A quiet insistence that no pain in her kingdom would ever again be allowed to vanish into silence. Ashmere's gates stood open now, day and night, with no guard demanding a name before anyone could pass through. Travelers came and went freely, and the village that had once been feared as a rebel stronghold was known instead as the place where the truth of a wound could finally be trusted. Lyra stood at the door of the healing house as evening settled over the rooftops, watching lantern lights spread from window to window across the village she had refused to let burn. She did not know if the ache in her hands would ever fully disappear. She had stopped needing it to. She healed it by making every wound tell who had ordered the bleeding.